2021, 2022 academic year. So thanks for coming today. And some of you I recognize in the audience have come to a lot of our programming this past year. Hopefully now, as the world comes back to more normal times, we get to be together doing this more often than not only via Zoom. And I know there must be some on Zoom. Do we have some folks at Zoom, Pablo? How many? All right, so there's a lot of people at Zoom, so that's fantastic. Thanks for joining us Zoom as well, and hopefully you can join us in person at some point soon. So today is a pleasure to have with us Dr. Gatsad, Professor of Marketing at Concordia University in Montreal. Gad holds the chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption, and has been a visitor professor at Cornell, Dartmouth, California, Irvine, among other places. Has written over 75 plus papers on the use of evolutionary psychology in the space of consumer behavior, but also, in addition to his scientific work, has been a leading public intellectual speaking about the ideas and pathogens that are destroying logic, reason, and science, and most important, common sense. So he's here joining us today. He already gave a wonderful talk this afternoon on his work on evolutionary psychology. But later in the afternoon, he's going to join us to talk about his latest book, The Parasitic Mind, how infectious ideas are killing common sense, which has been already a bestseller. And without further ado, Gad, please join us. Thank you. Hold the questions to the end. I'll sit with Gad over there. By the time we're done, I'm going to open for Q&A. Okay?
Hi, guys. Can you hear me well? Thank you all for coming. I guess with the additional 63, we can feel good that the attendance is reasonably good given the conditions. Great. So what I'm going to do is offer you a synopsis of some of the key ideas from the parasitic mind. It'll probably take me about an hour, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. All right, so let's begin with, so what are the two greatest threats to humanity? Of course, as I originally prepared this slide, as I was writing the book, COVID had not yet hit. So it was quite fortuitous to talk about this. There are two sets of pathogens that are dangerous to humans. One set are the parasites. I mean, the real biological, like malaria has a parasite. The viruses, the fungi, the bacteria that have wreaked havoc in our evolutionary history. But then, of course, I argue in the parasitic mind that there is a second class of pathogens, mind pathogens, idea pathogens that can parasitize our mind in a way that causes us to engage in suboptimal behavior, suboptimal thinking, and so on and so forth. So the story of the book is, here are these idea pathogens, here's how they originated, here's how they proliferated, and hopefully are there some vaccines that we can use to inoculate ourselves against these dreadful ideas. But so just very, very quickly, now, as an evolutionist, one of the tools that we use, if I want to study something in human behavior, I will often look at a homologous behavior in other animals. So for example, if I want to study toy preferences in humans, I could look at how vervet monkeys or rhesus monkeys, whether they have the same sex-specific toy preferences. And so when I was trying to come up with a framework to understand the departure from rationality that we're seeing all over the world, I wanted to find an animal model that I can use as a metaphor. And so I came across the field of neuroparasitology. Parasitology refers to the study of parasites, the relationship between a host and a parasite. So for example, you could have a tapeworm that parasitizes your intestinal tract. Neuroparasites head to your brain, to the host's brain, altering its behavior to suit the best interest of the parasite to the detriment of the host. And so examples of these, some of them you've heard of them, Toxoplasma gondii is a parasite that can actually inflict human minds, but the classic example is when it inflicts the mind of a mouse, the mouse loses its adaptive and innate fear of cats, and it actually becomes sexually attracted to the cat's urine, which is not a very good sexual preference to hold if you're a mouse. P. tenuis is a brainworm that can inflict the minds of ungulates, deer, moose, elk, and one of the manifestations that they experience when they are parasitized by this brainworm is that they engage in circling behavior. So they start kind of going around in a fixed action pattern where they keep kind of bobbing their head. And even if the looming predators are coming on them, they can't extricate themselves. They can't instantiate their flight response. And so, to the detriment of their own survival, they are pursuing a behavioral strategy that is best suited for the parasite. The third example I'll give, but there are millions of these in the neuroparasitological world, a spider wasp will sting a spider, rendering it zombified. It's still alive. It then carries the hapless spider down to the burrow. It lays eggs so that its offsprings can eat the spider in vivo. Now, why am I talking about this? Because I've argued that political correctness is akin to the spider wasp's sting, right? I am bitten or stung by the political correctness bug, and then I'm haplessly led to the abyss of infinite lunacy, kind of bobbing my head in a circular motion, just like the moose, okay? So that's what led me to originally use this framework of neuroparasites, hence the parasitic mind. So what are examples of these idea pathogens? And much of today's lecture, I'll be going over several of these. So in the middle, you see Death of the West by 1,000 Cuts. That actually was going to be the original title of the book, and then it was changed to the parasitic mind. So postmodernism is the granddaddy of all idea pathogens, and I'll talk about it in a second. Social constructivism, we are all born tabula rasa, and it's only socialization that makes us who we are. There are no biological forces that shape who we are. That's another imbecilic idea pathogen. Radical feminism is one. Cultural and moral relativism is another. Political correctness is another. So there's a whole bunch of identity politics is another. And so what I demonstrate in the book is that if you only took one of these idea pathogens, it might not be enough to destroy our edifices of reason. But once you create a cocktail, a melange of all of these idea pathogens, then we end up where we are today. We end up with a prime minister in Canada who is a walking manifestation of every idea pathogen that's ever been conceived, right? So I will take you through these. I'll begin with an idea pathogen that apparently one of the two parties in the US thinks it's a great way to organize society. And that's tribalism, collectivism, identity politics. Well, I come from the perfect model of a society rooted in identity politics. It's called Lebanon. Lebanon, you carry inside the country an ID card. In Arabic, it's called hawiyya. And in that ID card is written your religion. Are you Jewish? Are you Maronite? Are you Sunni? Are you Shia? And therefore, everything in the interaction in everyday society is viewed through the prism of your religious allegiance, right? So who gets to be prime minister or who gets to be president of Lebanon is determined by your religion. How many people get to sit in parliament is determined by your religion. So that's what tribalism, it never leads to a good place. It never leads to more freedom. That's what happens in Rwanda. That's what happened in Syria. That's what happened in the Balkans. And so imagine someone like me who escaped Lebanon in the mid-70s after the first year of the Civil War to now see the idea of identity politics being construed under the cloak of progressivism. It's nice to subdue my personhood to the greater collective. No, it isn't. Classical liberalism is about the celebration of my unique identity. I present myself to the world as Gatsad, not as Lebanese Jew of this skin you. Okay? So this is what Lebanon used to be when I lived pretty close to there, and this is where I grew up. That's what identity politics does. It always leads there. One of the offshoots of identity politics is what I call the DIE religion. And the reason why I reorganized the acronyms, diversity, inclusion, and equity. Typically people say EDI or DEI. No, it's DIE, because the DIE ethos is where meritocracy goes to die. Now, I've been warning about this for many, many years. I don't say this to be gleeful, to say I told you so, but people said, well, come on, this is just some esoteric nonsense happening in the humanities in some corner of the campus. It's never going to hit us. Well, now it's in every single field. It's in mathematics. My background is in mathematics. The distribution of prime numbers does not care about whether you are a transgender latex Muslima. The distribution of prime numbers is the distribution of prime numbers. But apparently, if you are a mathematician and you want to apply for a grant, you better explain how your research is going to be consistent with Dye principles. It's difficult to imagine that this is what we've gotten to. Now, in my life, I've argued that there are two great wars that I have faced. The first great war was the true horrors that I went through in the Lebanese Civil War. It's not manufactured victimhood. It's lived victimhood within my life. I put on running shoes and ran really, really quickly so that my head is not decapitated, is separated from the rest of my body. And so the second great war is the war on reason, science, logic, common sense, rationality that I've experienced now for almost 30 years as a professor. And so the parasitic mind is really a story of that war. Decolonize Science. Again, when I used to, you can go on my social media and track the tweets from many years ago when I'm saying, this is coming for you. Don't sit with apathy. Don't be cowards. It's coming for you, right? Well, mathematics is just a form of white supremacy. I put up a clip on my YouTube channel several years ago where I facetiously said, given my math background, that I was ready to announce to the world a new field that I had founded called social justice mathematics. It was a satirical piece. Well, fast forward 5 years, there is social justice mathematics, right? And now, why is it? Is it because I'm a prophet? No, it's because I'm able to see the downstream consequences of these ideas, and then I can prophetically satirize them. This is not how we wish to be organizing our universities. So, for example, a deputy minister in Quebec, where I hail from, at one point was arguing that it is wrong for us to be doing environmental studies using anything other than the scientific method. That seems to be a minimally provocative statement. He said that we shouldn't be using indigenous ways of knowing, and it's the scientific method. And then he had to apologize, and he's a racist, and he has to go to re-education camp to learn how to be a better human being. There is no other way other than the scientific method. Now, you could say, for example, that if indigenous people have lived in a particular area for 10,000 years, they might have domain-specific knowledge of the flora and the fauna in that ecosystem that allows us to ask them about that knowledge. But how you adjudicate hypotheses in science, there is no Lebanese Jewish way of doing evolutionary psychology. There is no person of color way of doing evolutionary psychology. There's just evolutionary psychology. That's what makes science the liberatory epistemology that it is. I can check my identity at the door and be equal to everybody else in tackling scientific issues. What I just said now is a terribly controversial statement. My goodness, all of the people from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment would be turning in their graves today, that a professor in the 21st century has to make such a banal point about the importance of the scientific method. This was exactly what I talked about. As a matter of fact, just to add, I donned usually when I do certain clips, I don the accoutrement of the social justice guy. And so I wore a super fierce red-colored hair because then it gives me greater credence. So for example, I argue that irrational numbers, which are real properties of, right, they marginalize mental health, we should get rid of them. I went through a very long list of things that we have to get rid of. I've had countless quite prominent mathematicians write to me and say, we sit in the faculty lounge watching these clips, cracking up at how what you satirized turned out to be true now. I mean, that's incredible that this is where we're at today in the 21st century. It's unbelievable. All right, so this one, some of you may have heard, many of you may have not, and even if you've heard it, it's worth repeating. So now I'm going to talk about the granddaddy of all idea pathogens, postmodernism. Postmodernism is an idea that basically says that there are no objective truths. We are fully shackled by subjectivity and by epistemological relativism. We are shackled by personal biases. So to speak of a universal truth is silly. It's impossible. So in 2000, in a second, you'll see why I've got these two images because they're quite relevant to the story that I'm about to tell. In 2002, I was invited I was asked by one of my doctoral students at the time who had just defended his dissertation under my supervision, invited to celebrate his finishing his PhD. Anyways, there was another co-supervisor, but it doesn't matter. And so he said, look, my wife is sitting here, so it was my wife and I were going with him, and he was bringing a date along. So he calls me tepidly before we went out to dinner, and he said, oh, I just want to tell you that the date that I'm bringing is a graduate student in postmodernism, women's studies, and cultural anthropology. To which I said, okay, so the holy trinity of bullshit. And I said, oh, don't worry, I get it. I get it. You want me to be on my best behavior. This is about you. This is about celebrating your PhD. Mum's the word. I'm going to be on my best behavior. Of course, that was a complete abject lie. About halfway through the evening, and I have a witness here who was at that evening. About halfway through the evening, I turned to the lady in question, very nicely, very jovially, and I said, so I hear you're a postmodernist. Yes. There are no universal truths. Yes, there aren't. I said, well, I study evolutionary theory, so I do think that there are human universals. Do you mind if I take a crack at offering you some universals, and then you can correct me about how I've erred? She said, yes, go for it. Now, this is, by the way, 20 years before men too can get pregnant, hence this image, right? 20 years ago, I warned. I said, okay, here's one universal, at least from my simpleton eyes, I think is a universal. Is it not true that within Homo sapiens, only women bear children? Is that not a universal? So she looked at me, scoffed at my imbecility, and said, absolutely no. I said, no, how is that? She said, well, there is a Japanese tribe of some Japanese island where within the folkloric, mythological realm of their cultural narrative, it is the men who bear children. So by you restricting the conversation to the biological realm, that's how you keep us barefoot and pregnant. So after I recovered from the mini stroke of imbecility that I had been exposed, and I was ready to speak again, I said, okay, maybe it was too controversial for me to propose something as corrosive as only women bear children. I get it. That was very dangerous territory. So maybe one that's a bit less laden with negative valence. Is it true that since time immemorial, sailors have relied on the following premise, that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west? And now we're going to come to the infamous dancing hyena. So here she used Jacques Derrida's deconstructionism, a nasty offshoot of postmodernism. Language creates reality. Labels define reality. There is no reality outside of language. So she said, what do you mean by east and west? And what do you mean by the sun? That which you call the sun, I may call dancing hyena. I said, well, fine, the dancing hyena rises in the east and sets in the west. To which she answered, I don't play those label games. So 20 years ago, I was interacting with a graduate student with whom I couldn't have a Venn diagram of meaning as to the following two statements. Women bear children, and there is east and west, and there is a thing called the sun. Now, in case you weren't paying attention, that particular person with whom I was talking was not an escapee from a psychiatric institute, although it's difficult to differentiate the two. She was a postmodernist student in a graduate program, aping exactly what you learn when you take courses in postmodernism. So other than the endless amount of money that a parent wastes sending their kid to learn this kind of nonsense, what is the trajectory of someone who learns that stuff? Are you going to build better bridges? Are you going to understand the economy better? Are you going to understand political behavior better if you're a postmodernist? No, that's why it's a parasitic idea. It is a form of intellectual terrorism. It's nihilism. It has no organizing epistemology. And yet I have sat on granting committees where out of 40 grant applications that I adjudicated, 35 were postmodernist stuff. Okay. Not good. So let's talk about the idea pathogen of cultural social constructivism. Social constructivism is everything is due to a social construction. Everything is tabula rasa. And so if you see the images at the bottom, these are actual ads from a actual company that was trying to be progressive. You know, the way that boys and girls learn to play with toys is because of your sexist patriarchal parents. If only we teach them how to play with better toys, then boys will quickly, you know, congregate to dolls, and girls can learn how to play with guns. And whenever someone espouses these ideas, you first wonder whether they're lobotomized, and then you wonder whether they've actually had children of the two sexes, because there's no better way to have those theories falsified very quickly by you simply having children whereby you recognize that there are individual differences and pervasive sex differences. But again, why let reality conflict with your ideology? So what I'm going to do next is show you a very, very powerful tool from chapter 7 of my book, which I call Nomological Networks of Cumulative Evidence. It's a methodology that allows me to demonstrate that a position that I'm taking is the veridical one. So if I want to show you and prove to you that toy preferences have a sex specificity, not because you have sexist parents, but rather because there are evolutionary and biological reasons why little boys and little girls might prefer these types of toys. How would I go about doing that? You do it by building what I've shown you here, which is a nomological network. What does that mean in less fancy language? I'm going to get you data from around the world, across cultures, across time periods, across animals, across disciplines, across frameworks, across methodologies, all of which triangulate to demonstrating that my position is veridical. So let's do a few of these. I won't do the entire network, but I'll just do a few. And again, it's an incredibly powerful tool for anybody in this audience, because if you're engaging in a substantive debate with someone and you want to demonstrate that your position is accurate, I don't need to emote louder than you. I don't need to be more hysterical than you. I don't need to insult you louder than you insult me. I show you this nomological network, and then you nod in agreement. And so this is what I'm going to do here. So I can get you data from developmental psychology showing you that children who are too young to have been socialized, by definition, in other words, I'm ruling out the possibility that is due to socialization by getting you infants who are 3 to 6 months old. And I can show you that those children already exhibit that sex specificity, okay? By what they look at more, by what they go towards to pick up, right? They can't speak or write a survey, but they can certainly exhibit that preference. So already that one box has invalidated the social constructivist idea pathogen, but I'm not going to stop there. I can get you data from across species, this one. So I can get you data from infants of vervet monkeys and rhesus monkeys and chimpanzees, showing you that their infants exhibit the same sex specificity of toy preferences as human children. Now that's looking pretty convincing, unless you want to argue that mommy and daddy vervet monkey are patriarchal and sexist in how they teach their little infant vervet monkeys how to play with toys, then you've got a problem. But I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to get you data from pediatric endocrinology, whereby there's a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. This is a condition where if little girls suffer from this condition, it masculinizes their behavior. So little girls who suffer from this disorder, endocrinological disorder, exhibit the exact opposite toy preferences. Their toy preferences become like those of little boys. So far I've gotten you data from developmental psychology. I've gotten you data from comparative psychology across animals. I've gotten you data from pediatric endocrinology. I can get you data from, where is it? This one here. I can get you data from 2,500 years ago, where an analysis of funerary monuments in ancient Greece and ancient Rome depicting children playing are shown depicted playing with the exact same toys that we see today. So now I got you data from 2,500 years ago. Someone in this room might say, yeah, but these are all Western cultures. Okay, no problem. I can get you data from non-Western cultures in sub-Saharan Africa, where the cultures couldn't be any more different than Western cultures. And I can show you that their sex specificity of toy preference are exactly the same as ours. I can get you data from the most feminine culture of the Western world, which is Sweden. It literally scores the highest on Hofstede's femininity scale. Sweden has engaged in a 40, 50-year social engineering program to eradicate gender, create a perfect gender neutral society, which Canada is trying to also emulate. Because a sexually reproducing species involving two phenotypes, it would be silly to talk about, two sexes. That would be a bigoted, a form of Nazism. So it turns out that in Sweden, which would be the perfect model by which you can test whether toy preferences are socially constructed, because as a social engineering program, they have attempted for the past 50 years to eradicate these gender differences. When they went and inventoried more than 40,000 toys in little boys and little girls' rooms, oh my God, it's as if biology matters. Swedish little boys and Swedish little girls prefer the exact same toys as anywhere else throughout recorded history. Now, I won't go through the whole network, but hopefully you're getting what the epistemology implies. When I'm trying to convince you of this fact, that there's a biological foundation to toy preferences, I put on my hat of the architect of this nomological network. What would be the data that I need to show you across time, across cultures, across animals, across space, that would hopefully convince you? Now, imagine if you use that tool on all of these important policy decisions. We're here at the Salem Center for policy, right? So for example, if you asked me, well, it's been a few years since Canada has legalized marijuana. Do you have a position on this, Professor Saad? My answer would be, with complete epistemic humility, I haven't built the requisite nomological network to be able to answer that question definitively for you. But when I do, good luck to the person who wants to debate me. So when I know, I know. And when I don't know, I keep my mouth shut with complete humility. So what the nomological network allows you to do is truly to adjudicate through these very consequential, civilizationally important arguments. I mean, yeah, forget about this. Let me give a few examples of the stuff that many of you have now woken up to, but this has been called Tuesday for me for the past nearly 30 years. So Jordan Peterson and I, a few years ago, were going to speak at an event literally titled The Stifling of Free Speech on University Campus. It was at Ryerson University. What happened to that event? It was stifled. So irony was lost on those folks. Not only it was stifled, so in case you think that your identity might protect you against the blue-haired Taliban, well, it turns out that it doesn't, because I'm a Lebanese Jew, and there were signs all over Toronto, both online and physically, all over the place, that we don't want Nazi fascists in Toronto. So even the Lebanese Jew who escaped execution in Lebanon, it turns out to be a neo-Nazi. That's the kind of opponents that I face regularly, been facing for 25, almost 30 years now. Again, this is not a very good omen of how we want to organize our centers of higher learning. This is when yours truly was differently weighted, because, to say that I was overweight would have been, it marginalizes people of girth. And so when I used to be differently weighted, but still extremely good looking, I was speaking in front of the Canadian Senate. I both gave a lecture in front of Parliament, and then I also gave testimony in front of the Canadian Senate on something that was called, it's now passed, called Bill C-16. Both Jordan Peterson and I, on separate days, appeared in front of the Senate to talk about some of the things we should be thinking about regarding Bill C-16. For those of you who hadn't followed what it is, it basically sought to incorporate gender identity and gender expression under the rubric of hate crimes. Now, I'm about as socially liberal as it comes to these issues. I don't care what you do, what you identify as. I believe that everybody should be treated with dignity. But I was arguing that beware of what you are passing because there are consequences to that. Well, those consequences have recently materialized in front of this audience. As I explained in my earlier talk today, you now have someone who's about to sit in the highest court who it turns out can't tell if someone is a woman or not because she just doesn't have the credentials. She's not a biologist, right? And as I joked, so I'll repeat the joke here because it bears repeating, it turns out that it was astonishing fluke that when my wife and I decided to found a family together, that I was able to find someone with whom I could have children, because how did I know that she was a woman given that I wasn't a biologist? I mean, I apply evolutionary biology, but I don't have a PhD in biology. So just through the happenstance of life, we were able to mate and then we created children. But otherwise, I might have been mating with one of the guys in this room. That's the justice in the US Supreme Court. This is not Gatsad satire. So when I appeared in front of this committee, I predicted this. I said, you're building a foundation that's going to lead to the proverbial dangerous slippery slope. Well, this hero of stupidity, which I subsequently called him Senator Genocide, during the question and answer period, he said to me, you are pro-genocide. You want to commit a genocide against transgender people. My testimony was pure, sober, scientific stuff. To which I answered, you may want to be careful about accusing someone who escaped execution in Lebanon of being pro-genocide. And then apparently he wanted to have that stricken from the record. I don't know if it was or not, but that's the level of political theater that we now see, right? A professor needs to appear in the 21st century in front of the Canadian Senate to say, no, there really is such a thing as men and women. It's astonishing. Let's skip this. Just a couple of quotes here that you might enjoy. Let me just put on my. This is a super liberal professor. I won't read all of them, but I have intentionally adjusted my teaching materials as the political winds have shifted. I also make sure all my remotely offensive or challenging opinions, such as this article, are expressed either anonymously or not anonymously. Most of my colleagues who still have jobs have done the same. So almost everyone, except maybe yours truly and a few others, will completely teach not to maximize intellectual enrichment of their students, but what is it that I should say or not say to ensure that I'm completely covered in terms of no one being offended against me? Again, that's probably not the way we want to organize our universities in terms of the maximal intellectual flourishment of our young people. Now, this, I wish I had come up with this idea myself. It comes from a neuropsychiatrist, but I discuss it in the Parasitic Mind and I apply it to the idea of pathogens that I cover in the book. So in evolutionary medicine, there's the concept of the hygiene hypothesis, which basically says, for example, if you look at children who suffer from autoimmune diseases or don't, let's say asthma, if those kids have grown up in highly sterile environments with no allergens, so they grew up with an OCD, neat-free pet mother or father, everything is clean, there's no pet dander, those kids end up having higher rates of asthma. The kids who grew up exposed to allergens end up having lesser autoimmune diseases. What's the argument from evolutionary medicine? Is that the immune system needs to be challenged, needs to be triggered in order for it to maximally function. Well, therefore, then I argue that the same principle applies to the maximal and optimal flourishing of our critical thinking abilities. Allergens in this case are called, get ready, everybody's seated, they're called opposing ideas. Sometimes we walk into a room where people might have an opposing idea, and it actually makes us be better debaters if we're able to be exposed to opposing ideas. But if we create a sterile environment with echo chambers where your opposing view is a form of linguistic violence against me, this is not hyperbolic. These are truly statements that are made. Well, then what happens? We create suboptimal individuals who are unable to construct, critical thinking arguments. And so the hygiene hypothesis really applies to what we're seeing on university campuses. By the way, some of you might still be of the opinion, well, but how prevalent is this really? Who cares about this? The analogy that I would draw for you is this. How many committed terrorists did it take in 9/11 to alter the landscape in New York forevermore? Was it 190,000 terrorists? Was it 19 million terrorists? Oh no, it was 19 terrorists. So you don't need tons of very, very ideologically committed people on campus to keep the rest of us in check, right? And so this kind of fascist bent has to stop. People have to be able to say whatever they want in the classroom. Professors have to be able to teach, research whatever they want. As long as you're being true to the scientific method, to reason, there is no forbidden knowledge. And the quicker we refine that reflex and that commitment to reason, the better we'll be. Speaking of echo chambers, here is the political affiliation between Democrats and Republicans. I know you probably can't read, I don't know if you can read them. So engineering, which is the least biased, is still 1.6 to 1 Democrats. So the least biased discipline still now, for those of you who know stats, or say, for example, in medicine, when you talk about the odds ratio of one drug being effective in solving whatever, if you talk about a 1 to 1.2 odds ratio, it's pretty good. So already 1.6 to 1 is a pretty, but that's the least biased one. As we go down the disciplines, you get to disciplines where you have 108 to 0. Okay? And usually the disciplines where it becomes more and more biased is precisely those disciplines where you would benefit most from having, a vigorous argument, right? There are very compelling arguments for and against abortion. There are very compelling arguments for and against the death penalty. But if you have people who are only able to hear one side of those, there are some things that are scientifically established, and there's really not much to debate at this point, even though even those things are only provisionally true, right? So imagine if you are in sociology or anthropology or all of the rest of the activist field, and you have ratios of the professors at 60 to 1 and 60 to 0. It's astonishing. It's not good. So, of course, as many of you have already heard, the die religion, the die czars are all about diversity for everything other than the one issue that they should really care about, which is ideological diversity. Oh, yes, the two great noble victims, but there are many others. So in the book, I talk about what is the reason for the orgiastic desire to be the greatest victim, right? So it is no longer, I no longer ascend the social hierarchy by being more productive than you, by being a harder worker than you, by publishing more papers than you, by doing more consequential. What really matters is that I simply have a better victimology story. Now, some of us actually do have victimology stories. That's why I usually win, because I hold the highest hand in victimology poker. But if you don't have a high victimology score, then no problem, just construct one, right? And therefore, you become, as Dave Chappelle said, you become like the French actor Je suis Smollett. Or you become like the first noble person of color who was a professor, first tenured professor of color at Harvard. You usurp the true victimology of a people. You piggyback on that so that hopefully you can get the orgiastic empathy scores. Now, what's the psychiatric reason for that? Well, it turns out that in 2010, I had published a paper in a medical journal on the evolutionary roots of Munchausen syndrome. And Munchausen syndrome by proxy. For those of you who don't know what those symptoms, psychiatric disorders are, Munchausen syndrome is when I fake an illness so that I can garner the empathy and sympathy of those around me. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is even more diabolical because I take someone who's under my direct control, my elderly parent, my pet, but most typically my biological child. Imagine how diabolical it is. Most people who suffer from Munchausen syndrome by proxy are biological mothers who harm their children so that they can then garner the empathy and sympathy. Oh, poor you, you have a sick child, right? So that's how I coined the term collective Munchausen and collective Munchausen by proxy, because I was familiar already with the psychiatric disorder. So now this is what you see on hyperdrive. Every email that I receive at my university is some story of victimology. There isn't just congratulations to Professor so-and-so who did something notable. It's congratulations to this victim. This victim is bigger than this victim. No, but not as big as this victim. That's what you see all day long. Well, my wife's family escaped genocide in Turkey. Then they moved to Lebanon. They escaped Lebanon because they were going to be executed. My family left, my grandparents left Syria because they were Syrian Jews because they were going to be exterminated. We moved to Lebanon. We were born all in Lebanon. We left Lebanon because we were going to be exterminated. That's part of our lives. That's part of our victimology. But what makes me the person that I am is not that I wallow in that victimology, is that I've overcome that victimology, is that it is part of my history and I talk about it and I recognize it and it has shaped me. But I'm standing here at the great University of Texas, Austin, proof that you can overcome. I didn't wallow in what happened to my ancestors 300 years ago using people that have nothing to do with anybody now. It's not 300 years ago that it happened to me. It's in my lifetime. I woke up for 25 years with nightmares from the war. And yet I didn't wallow in victimology. And yet we came with nothing to Montreal, Canada, and we made something of our lives. So there is no liberation in being a perpetual victim. None. It's actually an affront to human dignity. Here's an example of how data can be, oh, we still have about 15 minutes, okay. How data can be so problematic to a narrative of victimhood, right? Pesky data can get in the way. So every single day at the university, we receive emails of how to be better allies to women. Because it turns out, I didn't know this, that at all universities in Canada and the US, the amount of courage it takes for women to go to this patriarchal hotbed of genocide called the university is simply, I mean, the courage is unbelievable. It's like when Malala was trying to get the young girls to go to school in Waziristan and in Afghanistan, the courage it takes. So I said, you know what, let me go and check the data, because, you know, maybe it is still true that it's an absolute hotbed of genocidal misogyny at the university. So I got data from your country, the United States, that looked at the following. You ready? Across 4 levels of educational attainment, the associate's degree, the bachelor's degree, the master's, and the doctorate, and across 5 racial breakdowns. So for those of you who build these matrices in stats, if you're doing a chi-square distribution, you have a 4x5 matrix, so there are 20 cells. In each cell, the US government reports the ratio of men to women in that cell. So if we have a hotbed of patriarchy that we all should be working hard to still be allies to women because they're so held back, 20 of the 20 cells would have more men than women. Then my ears would perk up and say, whoa, that's weird. Now, here's where the data sometimes could not cooperate. It turns out that in 20 out of the 20 cells, so let me repeat, across every educational attainment level and every racial breakdown, women outnumber men. Okay? So there is no data that could falsify the narrative of victimhood anymore. I couldn't make it up. And yet, I still receive 680 emails. What have you done lately to be a better ally? And then my answer is, I've done nothing. I'm an ally to everybody who's worthy of my mentorship. I'm an ally to women. I'm an ally to men. I'm an ally to non-binary two-spirited. I'm an ally to tall people, short people, fat people, thin people, black people, white people. I don't adjudicate my allyship based on your ovulatory status. But apparently that itself is a very controversial statement. You're just not a good ally to women, Dr. Sad. It's insane. It's grotesque. Which leads me to Ostrich parasitic syndrome. This disorder causes a person to reject realities that are otherwise as clear as the existence of gravity. Sufferers of OPC do not believe their lying eyes. They construct an alternate reality known as unicornia. In such a world, science, reason, rules of causality, evidentiary thresholds, a near infinite amount of data analytic procedures, inferential statistics, the epistemological rules inherent to the scientific methods, rules of logic, historical patterns, daily patterns, and common sense are all rejected. Instead, the delusional ramblings of an OPS sufferer are rooted in illusory correlations, non-existent causal links, and feel-good progressive platitudes. Ostrich logic is always delivered via an air of haughty moral superiority. I'm going to try to petition to have this entered into the DSM-5 as a psychiatric disorder. Let's see if it works out. Now, how would I apply this, say, in a real-world context? This, by the way, is chapter 6 of the Parasitic Mind. So Ostrich parasitic syndrome basically is la, 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 I'm not listening, okay? So here we go. So it turns out that some very reputable people have built databases looking at terrorist acts across 70 countries. I listed them here. I won't read them, although just reading them would be a very powerful rhetorical ploy. I won't read them, but I put them for you in alphabetical order. Those 70 cultures couldn't be any more varied on every possible metric, on race, on skin color, on ethnicity, on economic system, on political system, on language, on every possible metric that you could think of. You have heterogeneity in those cultures, okay? And in those countries, since 9/11 alone, there have been more than 36,000 terrorist attacks committed in the name of one, we don't know exactly what the reason is. But it turns out that there are some bien-pensants, in French we say, some good thinkers, some noble thinkers in academia, who actually know the reasons why these terrorist acts have been committed. Even when the terrorist goes publicly and says, here are the 4 religious reasons why I am committing this, it turns out that it has nothing to do with what he said. He was lying. He was misinformed. The real reasons why the terrorist attack happened, I'm going to read you a few of these. There are many more in the book. It's due to lone wolfism. We have to combat lone wolfism. It's due to man-made disasters. It's because they played violent video games. These are not satire, by the way. I can give you the reference to each. It is because of lack of adequate exposure to art. I mean, who amongst us didn't growing up say, you know, I haven't seen enough Chagall, or I haven't seen enough Rembrandt. You know what? I'm heading to Raqqa to throw those gays off the rooftops. It's a direct causal link. Not enough art leads to extremism. It's a very, very clear link. And any of you who don't get it need to understand inferential logic better. It's due to beard bullying, the San Bernardino case where the husband and wife team committed some stuff. He was being beard bullied at work. I have a nice beard. If anybody beard bullies me, I can't be held responsible. It's due to poverty. It's due to climate change. The science guy, Bill Nye, explained to us a few years ago that the Bataclan attack in Paris, where the terrorists said exactly why they're doing it, because of their commitment to their religious fervor, was not due to that. You can, by the way, you can go and it's probably still available somewhere on YouTube. He explained that it's very much, and he gave the causal link of why it's due to lack of solar panels and CO2 emissions. That wasn't satirical. He really argued that. So Salem Center for Policy. How, if I am a policymaker in government and something as clear as the causal links of what causes people to, in this case, do these things. 36,000 plus terror acts in 70 countries since 9/11 alone. And my conclusion is we need to simply create better museums in the suburbs of Brussels so that people don't get radicalized. Then that's probably not good public policy making. Bad ideas have consequences. I won't go through this, but I built here a nomological network as to whether the religion of peace is truly a religion of peace. And by the way, I approach this with complete open-mindedness, meaning that I can collect the data, and if the data comes out suggesting that it is absolutely clear that wherever that ideology flourishes, we get more peace, then that's great. I'll leave it to you to read chapter 7 of the Parasitic Mind, where I build a very, very intricate. By the way, I never received any hate from anyone, despite the fact that it seems like I'm being quite direct in my criticism. Why? Because I've built the nomological. You can't argue against the data. So I don't have to, as I said, emote and be more hysterical than you. I just build the nomological network. I should be done very soon. I think maybe I have 2 slides left. So how to save our universities, since we're at UT Austin. Number 1, pursue knowledge unencumbered by ideological activism. No knowledge is forbidden if gathered objectively using the scientific method. Imagine if we didn't study physics because there was going to be the development of the atomic bomb. Tons of innocent people died when the US decided to drop 2 bombs. Well, you know, we should eradicate. Let's cancel physics because there are downstream effects to having physics lead to the development of really horrifying weapons. By the way, that's the logic that was used for why we stopped applying biology in the social sciences. Because a whole bunch of really cretinous people, the Nazis, eugenicists, British social class elitists, misused Darwinian theory to support their political ideologies. So the Nazis said, hey, there's a Darwinian struggle between the races. We're the Aryans. The Jews are at the lowest totem pole. If we get rid of them, well, that's just natural. That's just evolution. Of course, it had nothing to do with evolution, but they usurped evolutionary theory to defend their grotesque agenda. Well, so some social scientists said, well, great. We will get rid of biology in the social sciences, and hopefully that protects us from these kinds of things. You never murder truth in the pursuit of some consequentialist goal, right? You have to be deontological when it comes to truth, right? I could walk and chew gum at the same time. I could be all for transgender rights without saying, you know, we need to put female tampons in boys' locker rooms, right? Number 2, no more identity politics. Instead, promote the dignity of the individual rather than supporting oppression Olympics and victimology poker. No more coddling of the culture of offense and the ethos of perpetual victimhood. No microaggressions, no trigger warning, no safe spaces, no cultural appropriation, no crayons because Trump won, no petting the puppies because you got hurt. When Trump won, I'm Canadian, right? So I can always defend myself by saying, hey, I don't have a dog in this fight. When I saw the on my personal Facebook page, the hysteria that all my colleagues, these are professors. You know, I'm a woman of color who's a professor in Maine, and now I'm afraid to go to campus because Trump won. Because you think what? They're building rape gang centers at every street corner because Trump came. What kind of hysteric lunacy it is to, it's an affront to true victimology, but it was page after page after page on my personal Facebook page. Cut that out. A just society is rooted in the ethos of a meritocracy. We are not social ants. Why am I saying that? Because E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist who studied social ants, and in social ant society, you have a reproductive queen, and then everybody else is equal. They're interchangeable worker ants. So when he was asked, Dr. Wilson, your thoughts on communism/socialism, his answer was one of the greatest quotes of all time. Great idea, wrong species. Okay? We are a hierarchical species. Some of us work harder, some of us work less hard, some of us are smarter, some of us are less smart, for all sorts of reasons. We are not interchangeable cogs in one socialist utopia. I'll just mention this just because I'm frustrated. The Canadian and Quebec government decided that 58% of my brain, my ideas, my neuronal firings, my Lebanese experience, my 30 years as a professor is theirs. They took the royalties of my book. Why? Because they know better. They know how to redistribute it to those who are not as fortunate as someone who writes an international bestseller. Is that the way we want to organize society? Well, one political party in the US thinks so. Then you should move to Canada. You'll get exactly what you want. Promote an ethos of intellectual and political diversity. All ideas, beliefs, and ideologies are open to criticism. Everything. Nothing is sacrosanct. To debate, to mocking, to ridicule, and other forms of scrutiny, short of a direct incitement to violence, eradicate BS like hate speech laws, university speech codes regarding hostile environment, no such thing. Short of defamation, short of direct incitement to violence, anything goes. And let me walk the walk. I'm Jewish. I have my personal history. I support the right of Holocaust deniers to come on campus and engage in, by definition, the most egregious falsehood, which is the denial of a historical event where an entire people were being systematically eradicated. I support their right to spew their nonsense, because in a free society, that's the price you pay, right? You deal with racists, you deal with imbeciles, you deal with falsehoods, and yet noble Joe Biden now has a woman who is about 12 years old, but with the maturity of a 4-year-old, who's going to be the minister of truth. I wish it were satire. It's not. It's unbelievable. We shall regret it. Science, reason, logic, and a commitment to evidence-based thinking trumps ideology, hurt feelings, and fashionable anti-science for intellectual gibberish. And then I will end. Let me read this whole thing. This is from towards the end of my book, because this is one of the main reasons why people are silent. And when I'll read this, you'll understand why. This will be the last slide. To criticize Islam does not make you an Islamophobe, a nonsensical term, nor a hater of individual Muslims. To scrutinize radical feminism does not make you a misogynist. To question open borders does not make you a racist. You can have an open heart filled with empathy and compassion and yet reject open borders. I don't need to be lectured about the virtues of immigration. I'm a product of immigration, and I don't support open borders. To assert that trans women, biological males, should not be competing in athletic competitions with biological females does not make you a transphobe. Many situations in life involve a calculus of competing rights. With that in mind, the right of your 8-year-old daughter to feel comfortable and safe in a public bathroom supersedes that of a 230-pound, 6'2" trans woman. To reject the idea that so-called other forms of knowing, whether it is the indigenous way of knowing or postmodernism, are as valid as the scientific method does not make you a closed-minded bigot. To reject the hysterical demonization of white men as exemplars of toxic masculinity and white supremacy does not make you Adolf Hitler. So now this is the important lesson to take away. The name-calling accusations are locked and loaded threats ready to be deployed against you should you dare to question the relevant progressive tenets. Most people are too afraid to be accused of being racist or misogynist, and so they cower in silence. Keep your mouth shut and nod in agreement, or else prepare to be tarred and feathered. Don't fall prey to this silencing strategy. Be assured in your principles and stand ready to defend them with the ferocity of a honey badger. Thank you very much.
You can ask your questions. If you want to walk to the microphone, that's okay. But if you don't, you can ask from where you are, and I'll repeat the question over here as we're being recorded.
Sure.
So, who wants to start?
So you talked about having a lot of interests like criminology and whatnot in the past. So I was wondering how you sort of focused your interests or found this interest in yourself.
In terms of these culture wars?
No,
or the evolution?
Evolutionary.
Yeah, evolutionary psychology, I talked about it in my earlier talk at noon. It was my first semester as a doctoral student at Cornell. I was taking a course in advanced social psychology, and the professor had assigned a book called Homicide, and by two Canadian evolutionary psychologists, or Canadian-based evolutionary psychologists. And in the book, they were demonstrating that patterns of criminality happen around the world, across cultures, for the exact same reasons. And so therefore, irrespective of time or place, there are certain phenomena that transcend culture, that transcend eras. And the explanatory power of the evolutionary lens was so alluring to me that I decided to then use the evolutionary lens to apply it in the behavioral sciences and consumer behavior. So that's how I got into the evolutionary psychology stuff. In terms of the parasitic mind, in chapter 1 of the book, I talk about the two life ideals that shape my life, which are truth and freedom, for, I think, obvious reasons. And so I'm genuinely allergic to BS. So in other words, I can't stomach when I see people espousing nonsense, as any academic should be, because that's the currency that we use, right? We're supposed to create knowledge and then disseminate that knowledge. If that knowledge is corrupt and suspect, then we're frauds. And so I always tell people that when I go to bed at night and I lay my head on the pillow next to my lovely wife, in order for me to not suffer from insomnia, I need to feel as though I did everything that I could in a given day to rise up to defend truth. If I have equivocated, if I have modulated, if I let any careerist concerns decide that I shouldn't intervene, then I feel like a fraud. And I am my worst critic. So in order for me to go to sleep every night, I need to match that expectation of my personal conduct. And that's why I become Gatsad. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Use your science to give us an evolutionary theory on why these parasitic ideas that flow from postmodernism and its other offshoots have taken such hold in universities. And the second question is, parasites will sometimes kill the host.
Yes.
Is there a chance these ideas can kill university systems?
If we don't do an autocorrective mechanism, yes, they will. Or at least the cost for correcting will only get more costly as we go along. But to answer your first question, I actually addressed this in the book. So the question is, why do these parasitic ideas evolve? What makes them so alluring? And I offered an explanation in the book. Each of those idea pathogens start off with a noble goal. So take, for example, radical feminism. In its less virulent strain, as equity feminism, then I am an equity feminist, because it says men and women should not be treated differently under the law. There should be no institutional mechanism by which one sex is treated differentially better or worse than the other, and therefore I'm an equity feminist. Radical feminists then push that. They metamorphize that argument into, well, in order for us to fight the sexist status quo, we need to push the argument that men and women are indistinguishable from each other, because then that allows us to fight the status quo better. So it starts off with a noble goal that we can all sign up for, but then it shifts into la la land for consequentialist reasons. Now, and each of those idea pathogens has a similar story. So for example, cultural relativism, the idea of who are we to judge the cultural norms of another culture? Hey, if some cultures, they cut off the clitorises of little girls when they're 4, who are we to judge? Well, no, there is a deontological principle that says you're not allowed to take a child who doesn't have personal agency over their bodies and do this to them. But cultural relativism affords us that possibility. It again comes from a noble place. We don't want to impose our cultural imperialism onto us. So each of those idea pathogens starts off from a noble place, and then it goes into an offshoot of lunacy. Yes, sir.
Wrote down my question. I actually first discovered you on a Joe Rogan podcast, and
I'll be going tomorrow on Joe Rogan.
Oh, really? That's amazing. Found it very interesting. And my question today is, I'm sure you've heard of the term like toxic masculinity recently, and I wanted to hear your opinion on, do you think it is real, or is it like just masculinity, and what should I learn from that and like ignore about that movement, and any like advice you have to a young man trying to transition from like a boy to a man, and advice on how to navigate today's postmodern world. It's a loaded
Well, a lot of questions, each of which could take 5 hours. So the first one, I wrote an article that had gone super viral several years ago on my Psychology Today column. I think, if I remember the title correctly, is toxic masculinity a valid construct or concept? So certainly you can read that article and answer. I'll just summarize it very quickly. Do you know how, do most women fantasize for the archetype of the fireman, or do they fantasize over the pear-shaped geeky guy who has memorized his logarithmic scale? In other words, that which is called toxic masculinity for one is called women's fantasies, right? So now toxic masculinity doesn't mean that you're a brute or you're a brash or you're a criminal or you're aggressive. But there are certain traits that around the world are viewed as very attractive and the prototypical archetype of a male and similar to a woman. So for example, romance novels. Romance novels are almost exclusively read by women, okay? And they're read by women around the world. That study has been done, what I'm about to say. Evolutionists have studied what is the archetype of the male hero in a romance novel. It's the exact same guy. I mean, literally every romance novel that's ever been written has the exact same male hero. He is tall, he is a count and a neurosurgeon. He wrestles alligators on his six-pack and bites off his head. He can't be tamed because he's reckless and dangerous, but he can only be tamed by the love of this one good woman. I just described every single romance novel that's ever been written. That guy, he's called toxic masculinity. But the market has decided, by women consumers, that that's what I fantasize about. So toxic masculinity is a bullshit term. Advice: be true of who you are and be proud of who you are. You don't need to apologize for immutable traits, and then the rest are details.
As a former biology major, I really liked your use of the idea of pathogen analogy, also drawing upon Richard Dawkins' idea of the meme. So I'm curious to know, like, how has social media contributed to the spread of these terrible ideas, and also from a Darwinian standpoint, since they're bad, what do you think is the short-term evolutionary advantages of adopting ideas? Well, how can like the good ones ultimately win out in the end?
So I'll talk about the first part. So Richard Dawkins in 1976 wrote a classic book, which I highly recommend you all read it if you haven't, called The Selfish Gene. And in the book, he talks about the meme, which now we all know it in the common parlance. But the meme, in his context, was the cultural analog of the gene. In the same way that genes can spread, can propagate in a population, since we are also a cultural animal, memes can propagate. And they propagate through mimetic transmission. An idea is a meme. When you read my book, I'm infecting your mind with my memes. A library is a collection of memes. The difference between his mimetic framework and my parasitological framework, memes could be of any valence. A meme could be a positive meme, it could be a neutral meme, it could be a negative meme. Whereas the neuroparasitological model is only negative. It only destroys the host's ability to think. In terms of social media, look, social media is a two-edged sword. It can help us make good ideas go viral or make bad ideas go viral. The problem is that many of the participants on social media tend to be of the blue-haired Taliban variety. So then they get a greater platform from which to spew their ideology. If folks on the other side of the aisle were to be as committed in their social media engagement, I think we might be able to get rid of these ideas a bit more quickly. Thank you, sir.
Kind of wanted to more pick your brain about this topic because, as you mentioned, radical feminism usually implies that you're trying to assume the genders are equal on all fronts. However, certain things that you think would be helpful to protecting women is that sexual assault is almost entirely a male predominated thing that occurs, as eloquently demonstrated in Why Men Behave Badly by David Buss.
Of course.
I wanted to pick your brain about how you think policies should include these sexually dimorphic characteristics while still maintaining some feminist aspect of it.
Yeah, wow, great question. So I recently had on my show, for those of you who don't know, forgive the shameless plug, but I for many years now, I've, just like how, say, Joe Rogan does, I invite people on my show, typically academics, but not always. And we just have these very beautiful long form chats. One of my recent guests is Randy Thornhill. Randy Thornhill is an evolutionist at the University of New Mexico who, speaking of sexual assault, do you know where I'm going with this? Yeah. So he wrote a book in 2000 with an anthropologist named Craig Palmer, where they were making an argument for the evolutionary reasons why rape exists. And they got in such trouble that Randy, who's very mild-mannered, very meek, from what I know, quite liberal, progressive guy, he was trying to offer a scientific explanation of rape so that we can have better public policy interventions. But what ended up happening, as I explained in my earlier talk today, when you use evolutionary theory to explain a phenomenon, people oftentimes wrongly presume that you are justifying the phenomenon. You're condoning it. You're granting scientific imprimatur for why it's okay for it to exist. Of course, he was doing nothing for that. He's saying, if we want to help solve the grotesque problem of sexual assaults on women, let's really find what the causes are. So, for example, the mantra that rape has nothing to do with sex and it's strictly an act of power is the height of insanity. And the number of times that you could repeat it in your women's studies class is not going to alter the fact that rape is asexual. If all it was is an act of violence, there are many other ways by which I could instantiate that act that are not related to sexuality. So, bad ideology results in bad policy. So, so the specifics of which policy I won't get into now, but to your point, someone who, with all good intention, was trying to help solve the problem was skewered. He had to have police security for a long time after, when his entire goal was to protect women from rape. He became a so-called rape apologist. So it's a very delicate balance.
Let me follow up on this question and see maybe something you have in mind. Are you thinking about other things, like, for example, the way we educate children? Do you think there are room for, let's say there is a clear sexual difference between learning or how things develop? Are you thinking about social policies that would say, well, let's recognize that and build policies that are equitable, but taking that into account? Do you have any other example in mind, or?
I'm a little confused by your question. I'm sorry.
Just thinking that I was just wondering if you had examples of public policies that beyond.
That I've seen personally, or that.
Or just theoretically. Yes.
Well, theoretically, I think that it's important for, just in my personal opinion, for these sexually dimorphic characteristics to be addressed. I think the statistic is 99% of all sexual assault is perpetrated by men and 90% of all victims are female. And I think addressing that and also the evolutionary reasons behind the whys can give people not necessarily it's not condoning it, but giving people a greater sense of understanding of their actions and therefore control over them. If you understand that ultimate explanation as to why you want to go rip that girl's clothes off, you could maybe more have an ability to stop yourself sooner, because you recognize it's not just me being me, or it's not her being her, it's my overall evolutionary, my brain was evolved. I hate using that word in that way, but in this case it applies. My brain evolved to think that way. So I think policies should definitely.
So I can give you an example, and I actually wrote many years ago an article on my Psychology Today column that I think is very relevant to what you're asking. So I can't remember her name, but there was a teacher about 10 years ago who, a female teacher who was, let's say, 23. And she got into a relationship with one of her students who was, 17 years old, 364 days old. So, a child who's a victim. And that victim, called a willing participant in having a 23-year-old woman wanting to be my sexual partner, who was waking up every day saying, thank God that I'm so fortunate that I have this beautiful woman. It turns out, because the law wants to make it seem as though there are no sexually dimorphic differences in terms of who is a pedophile, put her on the sexual offender registry in exactly the same way that you would for 99.99% of pedophilic recidivist serial pedophiles who are men, because they didn't want to demonstrate that there are any differences between men and women. Now, I don't know if any of you know the ending of that story. She was told when she got out that she can't approach children and speak to them in any way that might be, lascivious. So she was working in some, whatever, a Denny's or whatever, where one of the co-workers was, let's say, a 17-year-old. And that co-worker, who was a girl, was telling her about her boyfriend problems. That turned out to be a violation of her parole thing. So because what's the legal system trying to do? It's trying to eradicate something that a three-day-old pigeon would know, which is, if we really care about protecting children, there isn't an equal likelihood that both men and women are going to abuse children sexually. You should have seen the hate I received for saying that.
Oh,
so
I bet you received tons.
it's unimaginable. So I'm saying, in this case, the opposite. Like, I'm not saying men are, I'm saying, if you want to protect children, recognize that men are much more likely to be the pedophilic aggressors. That was viewed as terribly sexist.
Which is incredibly contradictory, considering, that what the goal of feminism is to protect women from things like this. And all the data shows that here's your problem. It's men's evolved psychology.
Well, and that's why I say parasitic, right? Because it just destroys your ability to think clearly. Look, I didn't put this up today, but there is a group called, and I'm not using this term, it's their term, Queers for Palestine. Okay, if I am a member of the LGBTQ community and I have two choices, I can either be Queers for Tel Aviv or Queers for Gaza. Which do you think would be beneficial to my community?
It's funny. I'm also Jewish, and that made me laugh inside.
So imagine how parasitized your mind must be, where you have two places very close to each other geographically. In one place, it's one of the meccas, forgive the term, of the LGBT community. It's called Tel Aviv. So short of San Francisco, New York, and Montreal, Tel Aviv would be one of the hotbeds where LGBTQ community could express themselves. No. But Israel is a genocidal country. But the place where we throw the LGBT community off buildings,
where they're the most oppressed.
Where they're the most oppressed, that's where I put up my sign. It's insane.
It is.
Let's go next question. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Gatsad. So I was wondering if you could provide a follow-up to something you said towards the end of your talk, which was that you kind of avoided a lot of the outrage because of this approach you have of using the nomological diagram and considering all these different sides to a particular issue. But I think of someone like Brett Weinstein, who for a pretty trivial thing had a lot of outrage and eventually left. And I think that when people get upset that like a professor is talking a particular way, they're not going to listen to everything they have to say. Like, I was talking about this from an evolutionary standpoint and a social standpoint. Like, I was wondering if you could clarify why you think that this is sort of the reason you've avoided a lot of the outrage. A lot of people.
We kind of briefly touched upon it earlier. It comes up often where people say, how come you seem to say things that are unbelievably more controversial than anybody else, and yet you somehow, it doesn't hit you, the cancel culture? And I think it's a constellation of things. Number one, I am dispassionate in the way that I present this stuff. Oftentimes I use humor. I smile. There is a natural way by which I present things that make. I once spoke to a guy who had invited me on his show, and at the end of the show, he said, I came with every intention to despise you, but God damn it, I can't help but like you. So it's a personal style. I also score very highly on victimology poker. So if you're going to use all your stuff, I'm going to outrank you, guaranteed. So there is no story that anybody in this room can come up with that can come close to my story. Therefore, I'm a difficult guy to cancel, knock on wood. So I think it's that unique combination of things that makes it a bit. Plus, I'm a honey badger, meaning that if you come after me, you better not miss because I'm coming after you and anybody you've ever known before, metaphorically speaking. And that makes it intimidating for people to come. I mean, what do you do when you go to prison the first night? What do they tell you should do?
Shank somebody in the shower?
Exactly. Get it done quickly so that everybody understands the signal. Don't mess with me. And so when I have interactions on social media, I'm a very affable, mellow guy, but I can be triggered into being a honey badger precisely because I use it as an audience effect, which is you come after me, get ready. And so for all these reasons, I end up being able to escape cancel culture.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Great, thank you for the talk. So I'm an energy guy. I think a lot about energy and the economy, and I've thought about some of these evolutionary principles. So one is short part of the first question is, do you have any thoughts about, I don't know, group selection versus individual selection type of issues in relation to, the book and the areas you think about? Second is, how do you view, I would say, accurate representations of the world, scientific method, accurate representations as compared to, I would have this sort of hypothesis. If you have a more accurate representation, you will be able to build more things, do more things, extract more resources from the environment, and say build the economy, for example. Of course, you're arguing that we're getting infected with inaccurate representations of the world. Do you have any reason why we would go to inaccurate representations if maybe from an evolutionary sense we would expect the societies with the more accurate representations to eventually win out, or is that what you expect?
So let me address the first one, then I'll do the second one. Excuse me. The first question was, at what level does selection happen in evolutionary theory? So we used to think that it happened at the individual level. In other words, evolutionary mechanisms are selected at each individual. Then there was something called group selectionism, which most evolutionary theorists reject now. The main proponent of it still today is someone named David Sloan Wilson, who's a group selectionist. Group selectionism basically argues that evolutionary mechanisms can be selected at the group level. So the example that I discussed in my earlier evolution psychology talk was on, for example, explaining religion via a group selectionist argument. And so here's how it would work. If group A is highly religious and group B is not religious, being religious affords the religious group greater communality, greater cohesion, greater cooperation. So these very earthly things cause the members of the religious group to outsurvive the members of the non-religious group. But I am making the argument at the group level. Most evolutionists today reject this because they argue that any mechanism that supposedly is explained at the group level could be explained at the genetic level. In other words, you can reduce it to the gene level. And that's what Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene was talking about, that all the phenomena that we study in evolutionary theory, the unit of analysis or the unit of selection is the gene. So there are very, very few evolutionists today that still espouse the group selectionist argument. Regarding your second point, what are the benefits of having an accurate representation of the world? Well, there are two ways I can answer it. From a deontological perspective, if I am in the business of seeking truth, I want accurate representations of the world. I want to truly study that there is such a thing called sex differences that truly exist. But from a practical perspective, I can't build bridges using postmodernist physics. I can't build better economic models or environmental models using postmodernist, modeling. And so having an accurate representation of the world allows us to place a man-made object on a moving comet. And so truth matters, whether it be at the deontological level or the practical level. There's no other way to say it. Thank you.
Dr. Saad, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I'm also Lebanese,
Oh,
but I'm not as big of a victim, so I won't try to play.
okay. So your opinion doesn't matter as much as mine.
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
And since you're not shy of controversy, I'm wondering, how do you apply, or how do you think about your ostrich parasitic syndrome in light of COVID?
Yes.
And then generally speaking, when you believe that someone has OPS, how do you counter it? Like, what do you do when you're interacting with them?
I try to drown them in evidence if I have that evidence. But the method that I talked about here, the nomological networks, there is a caveat to it. If I'm trying to convince you with my nomological network, you have to at least be intellectually honest enough to allow me the room to present it to you. If literally you shout me down, if literally you go la 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 and don't grant me the courtesy to show you the network, then I can't do anything. But as long as you say, you know what, I'm giving you 15 minutes, show me your network, then I'm going to drown you in a tsunami of evidence. So, and this is frankly one of the reasons I think that the earlier gentleman said, you know, why don't you get canceled? Because it's hard to cancel an overwhelming amount of data that is in support of what you're saying, right? So I don't have to scream and be hysterical. But again, that causes me to be very calibrated. I really, when I speak about something, I do it with full authority. And if I don't know, then I present myself to the world as someone who just simply doesn't know. And by being calibrated this way, it saves me getting into trouble, right? So I can go on a show like Joe Rogan's tomorrow with, I don't know, 20 million downloads, and I'll never say something that gets me into trouble because I so well know what I know and don't know. So I think if people have that epistemic humility, it will save them a lot of trouble.
So what is the parasite that stopped, let's say, our scientists, the experts, to being a little bit more humble about what to do in light of COVID? We're told some very basic facts that were like non-question. If you question, you are canceled, whatever it is, right? So there were clearly some things that scientists were putting forward and said, this is going to happen no matter what, unless you do this.
So you mean you don't agree that 100,000 people marching at the BLM march would not cause any transmission of the virus because
that
the
you
virus...
told us you have to be home, locked down for 6 months, right. Correct? Yes, yes.
Because they are ideologically parasitized.
I understand they are ideological parasitized for the supporting the BLM marches. I understand that virus. That's all right. We talked a lot about them today. But what is the virus that made them be so epistemically non-humble at first when we were called to, hey, what should we do here? Epidemiologists, what should we do here? We have a new virus. And they all came in unison and said, lock down the world, no matter what, kids stay home. No idea of cost-benefit analysis, no even question, like, you know what, is that a good idea? Have we ever tried this before? I don't know. Do we have any evidence that's going to work? None of them did that.
You know, and it's funny because, you know, you have a background, I have a background in mathematics and operations research where you do modeling, where you do, you know, decision-making, maximizing the objective function. And I used to watch these guys speaking with total authority when, you know, you have a hard time building a model to predict the waiting time at a bank teller's thing, and yet people would come up on a system that is so multifactorial. You know, His Eminence Lord Fauci would say things that are just impossible. I think that probably simply comes from the kind of the God complex, right? People are not sufficiently humble to say, you know, I don't know. Look, one of the best ways to establish trust with your students is I'll walk into a classroom and there's a room of 21-year-olds and someone asks me a question and, you know, they all know me and have heard of me and they come in all excited. And then they ask me something and I say, wow, what a great question. You know, I don't know the answer to this. Why don't you email me and I'll try to look into it? That builds trust. Why? Because I didn't try to BS my way out of that. I actually was humble enough to say, you just stumped me. I don't know the answer to that. I think most people, certainly people of authority, certainly people who wear a white lab coat all day, suffer from the God complex, therefore they don't equivocate. It's an ego defensive strategy.
So you have been through actual difficulty, experiences in your life, and yet you've chosen to not identify as a victim, and you've maintained a very high level of personal power, seemingly, throughout that.
Yes.
And so my question is, one, what do you think is the reason that you've continued to maintain that power even through those difficulties? And for when people are going through actual difficult experiences, whether socially justice topics or just generally in life,
yes,
what advice would you have for people to maintain
great
their
question.
personal power through that?
Thank you for that question. I mean, just like some people have green eyes, other people have brown eyes, the unique combination of my genes makes me that the adversity that I faced made me more desirous to succeed. So for example, I even grew up with some difficulties in my nuclear family, where for many years after we moved from Lebanon to Montreal, my parents were absent. They had returned to Lebanon. Actually, in 1980, they were kidnapped by Fatah. And I talk about this briefly in chapter 1 of The Parasitic Mind. And so many of these episodes that many of you may not have even heard of could have sent me straight into wallowing in victimology for the rest of my life. My unique combination of genes made it that I had this thing of, I'm going to shove it up everybody's ass, if you forgive the colloquialism. I'm going to succeed. It's that. And so part of it is my unique genes, but part of it's also the cultural expectations. And I talked about this earlier at the cafe we went. So, and let me share that story with you. So after I finished my MBA and I was heading to pursue my PhD, one of my brothers, who was a very successful entrepreneur in Southern California, was trying to convince me to go into working with him, take a break from doing my PhD and work for a few years. When I returned to Montreal after having visited him in Southern California, my mother caught wind of the fact that there might be a chance that I might put my studying on hold. And she asked me to go to another room. You know, she was kind of very concerned, and I was wondering, what is she going to tell me? She said, well, I caught wind of the fact that you might not pursue your PhD right away. Do you want people to remember you as somebody who dropped out of school? So I already had a bachelor's degree in mathematics and computer science. I had an MBA, but if I were to stop after my MBA, I would have brought great shame to the family as a school dropout. So that's the environment I also grew up in. Right now, I didn't pursue my PhD to please my parents. I mean, it had nothing to do with it, but that's the standard of excellence you said. So the way I would answer your second question is, here I'm going to borrow a term that a good friend of mine, Lebanese author Nassim Taleb, has proposed, anti-fragility. But of course, the concept has existed for thousands of years. Right, you know it. So we grow by going through anti-fragility, right? That which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Those sayings exist precisely because through anti-fragile mechanisms, it makes me stronger as long as it doesn't kill me. So there is no magic recipe. Look, I'm going to be very personal here regarding last week when I found out that the Quebec and Canadian governments were going to, I mean, literally steal more than 50% of my neuronal firings. I went into a deep depressive existential crisis. I was wondering if I would have the moxie to come to give this talk here. I even spoke to Lorne, whom I didn't know prior, because I'm still desperate about it. But guess what? I'm gonna shove it up their ass. And so that. So, you know, there's no exact magic recipe, but hopefully by me saying this, it empowers others, and so on goes the circle. Cheers.
Professor Saad, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule
to
visit here. Hope you're enjoying the weather. I've been a follower of yours for on YouTube for several years. I'm actually half Armenian.
You're Armenian?
Half.
Half Armenian, okay.
Half. Yeah. Father. One of your main points is that we should be intellectually curious about the world, even if the things we learn are difficult truths that are unpopular and suppressed by the prevailing pop morality in society. In this country, there's probably no other more harshly suppressed and enforced morality than on the topic of race. This enforced pop morality is essentially egalitarianism, in that nurture is king, nature is nothing. And so the reason why there are differences in crime rates, differences in SAT scores, differences in incarceration rates because of the different races is all due to social factors like discrimination, white racism, and so forth. And if you pull it back to the societal level, the reason why a country like Denmark has one of the highest standards of living in the world, and a country like Haiti has the lowest standard of living on the Western Hemisphere, is because of social forces. So the Haitians are such victims of slavery and colonialism, and the Norwegians or the Danes are such beneficiaries of colonialism and white supremacy. And therefore, and it has nothing to do with genetics. So therefore, if Danes decide to want to keep their country predominantly Danish, then that is evil. You know, they are evil. And so, you know, I think this morality is very wanting, you know, in terms of logic. And so my question is, I was wondering what you think if you were to perhaps interview someone like Jared Taylor, who I think rather eloquently refutes.
Who's Jared? I don't know.
Jared Taylor, he's a white advocate. He is smeared and slandered as a white supremacist by all the same castrati, ostrich people that you know very well. But I think if you look through his work, I think there's almost nothing morally disagreeable about what he says. I think there would be a very amicable and fruitful discussion. Now, the question is, or the issue is, you would face enormous backlash for associating with an inch of this person by academia and by big tech. And so the question is, how much would it be worth engaging in a conversation with someone like that?
So I don't know him, and I don't know his stuff, so I couldn't speak about him in particular. What I can tell you is that I've never invited people on my show or not as a function of these types of calculus issues. So I've known other academics or public intellectuals who specifically will not speak to someone because it will hurt their brand image. Well, I've spoken to several highly controversial people on my show. So example, Tommy Robinson, who's a activist out of Britain, who, you know, was a anti-Islam critic. People thought, you know, why are you speaking to this bigot? You know, he speaks with a low class, you know, affectation.
Classism.
It's unbecoming of you as a, you know, professor of a stature.
He's a hooligan, yeah.
Right? I've spoken to Robert Spencer, another guy who's so I've spoken to ex-Muslim extremists whom other people would have said, why do you give them the time of day? So I never say yes or no as a function of these kinds of brand imaging issues, but I do decide whether I should speak to you or not as a function of whether we're likely to have a fruitful conversation. So for example, so while I respect the right of Holocaust deniers to spew their stuff, I won't invite them on my show to debate whether the Holocaust happened.
I'm sure that would not be a fruitful conversation. But I think with someone like this individual, I think there would be a fruitful conversation. And because, I mean, you can just watch interviews, read the works.
Are you his representative or something? Because you're pushing him a lot. Or are you friends with him? Or
no, I just find the arguments to be persuasive.
Okay, I'll check it out. Thank you.
Let's go next question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead. First, he was here first. Yep. No, he was here first. Yeah, go ahead. You're next.
So, thanks. So, two questions I think are related. I'm not sure which would go first, but first one is, it seems to me at least that a lot of the insanity, as you're talking about, the parasitic insanity, came on very quickly. And first question is, how did it's at the highest levels. These are people who are smart. And besides the politicians who have agendas, we're talking heads of major corporations, lots of people who run seemingly all the universities.
Presidents of universities. Yeah.
You know, and it seems like, you know, maybe I can't tell if it's like most of them or not, but huge amounts of them in the high schools, in the school boards, and everybody who seems like they should know suddenly seems to be having this religion. I'll call it religious behavior. Sure. You know, so the first question is, how did these are smart people who know how to reason, and why is it so pervasively crazy at that level? And then it may be related to this, even though then there's a fear issue, but you had a couple slides ago, you had a list of what we need to do differently. You know, in the universities, you need to stand up for what you're doing. We need to not have these types of things happen. When you have a world where it's like the air is polluted. Everything, whatever you breathe, and it's hard to even get away from it inside. And it's almost, I'm not, to me, I'm looking at this, I'm saying, yes, we need all those, but it's kind of like saying, to me, it's like saying, don't breathe the air. You know, it's so hard, it feels like, for normal people to not, to do those things.
Right.
And survive. You know, how does one get those things to happen?
Okay,
Or
so
not one, how do
right.
we as a society?
So let me answer your first question first, and then the second
Sure.
one's next. As I explained in the parasitic mind, every single one of the idea pathogens was spawned on university campuses by smart professors. So meaning that being educated and smart does not inoculate you against the parasitic ideas. As a matter of fact, it's professors who came up with every single one of those idea pathogens. So simply being educated does not inoculate you. To kind of rework a famous George Orwell quote, you know, it takes intellectuals to come up with, you know, the dumbest ideas. Right. So this, right. So I've petitioned facetiously that to the 7 deadly sins, there's an 8th missing, and it's called cowardice, right? So Westerners, it turns out, are invertebrates. They don't have a spine, and they're castrated. So no testicles and no spine. So this is how you end up with HR departments and Disney and so on, where there are 7 blue-haired Taliban that could keep the rest of us in check because they're so scary. Well, if you think that the blue-haired Taliban are so scary, you should have lived in my childhood in Beirut, right? Where entire neighborhoods were being executed on Tuesday. So people overestimate how dangerous it is. They are cowardly. They are responding to the most vocal, ideologically committed people. But here's some good news for everybody in this room. The silent majority detests this stuff. And I know this because I received the millions of emails from professors, from corrections officers, from military people, from police people, from the trucker, all of whom say, thank you, thank you. Oh, but if you read my email on your show, please don't mention my name. And then my response to them is, do you not think that thank you very much for your great compliments, but by the way, do you not think that the last sentence of your email is exactly why we are in this problem? So it's cowardice. And so unless we're able to find our spine, to, excuse the colloquialism, grow a pair, the problem won't go away. I appeared on Tucker Carlson in October, and I'm proud to say that during the show, he cracked up laughing because I said, look, if people find their voice and you know, speak out in unison and activate their inner honey badger, we'll get rid of this problem by next Tuesday. And if we don't, it will be a slow train ride to hell. So, so that's the second question. Not everybody has Joe Rogan's platform. Not everybody is, you know, the professor with the parasitic mind. But everybody can affect change within their sphere of influence. What does that mean? You're a student and your professor says something that is insane, challenge them politely. Somebody says something on your Facebook page that you think is objectionable, either challenge them publicly or go to the pub. In other words, don't diffuse the responsibility onto the few brave ones who will take up the mantle for the rest of us. And if everybody does that, some with large platforms, some with small platforms, if everybody commits to getting engaged, that's how there's no other magic recipe, right? You had tons of men land on the beaches of Normandy, most of whom were mowed like little mosquitoes by German machine gun, and many of them did that, and voila, eventually the war was won. But that's why I do what I do.
Do you think it's part of it is not seeing the consequences quite yet? Like in Germany, in the Germany thing, well, the knowledge is like, well, you know, the world's about to end. These crazy people are going to start killing us all. Exactly. So you fight it. Whereas right now we're still in a pretty comfortable society where pretty much most people do really well. There's abundant energy available right now. That might change if we keep going in a certain, right? So there's lots of things that we might not have anymore, but we're not quite there yet. So we need to, these parasites are going to have to be around us for a little bit longer until planes start falling in the sky, because we're hiring not based on the ability to fly a plane, but rather by your, victimhood status.
And this is by the way, when I don't know if I mentioned earlier, the typical response that I would get when I would go and scream from the top of the mountain, the answer I would get, even till today by some people, come on, aren't you exaggerating how serious this problem is? It only affects a few esoteric folks in the humanities. No, our prime minister imposes policies that are based on every one of those parasitic ideas. So it's exactly what you said. It's the vividness of the ill effects of these parasitic ideas are hard for people to grasp, especially when it doesn't touch them. So for example, when I warned people that if you allow folks to come into your country in huge numbers where their cultural and religious values are perfectly antithetical to yours, it's not going to end well. You don't need to be Einstein or Newton to get it. Well, a lot of those people who used to write to me and say, come on, aren't you being bigoted against the noble people, now say, oh, oops, it's in my neighborhood now, and I'm afraid to go to that park because they see it now. It's vivid. And so it's a very difficult thing to do, but hopefully by engaging people, people will wake up.
I think COVID was a wake-up call. Perhaps the insanity of the past 2 years might have shown people that, wait a second, don't trust those. They can actually hurt you quite a bit.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for your talk and for championing the virtue of courage.
Thank you, sir.
I'm reminded of novelist philosopher Ayn Rand, who said that confidence and courage are practical necessities. So it helps to really have that ability to speak your mind and write your mind. I noticed that in Hong Kong, for instance, those people really wanted to stand up against the power that overtook them, essentially, not allowing free speech and free press. Tangential to the nurture issue, do you have any problems with the arguments for determinism, for example, proffered by Sam Harris against free will? And like it may be a slippery slope into thinking that you're not making any choices, you're just fated to do certain things, and it's kind of self-empowering, rather than being able to think that you're making choices and have values and charting your course and not finding yourself in situations where you're overpowering somebody.
Right. I wonder why Sam Harris, who's a strong proponent of free will, got upset at all of the great unwashed who voted for Donald Trump, because after all, they had no free will to determine anything. So I'm not a big fan of the free will argument, because it gets you nowhere, right? We are clearly within the purview of the mechanistic laws of physics and chemistry. And so, yes, there is an exact causal chain that could be explained at the molecular level for why I chose product A rather than product B. What does that get me? So I really have nothing else to say other about this. And I've had a guest on my show who's a very respected philosopher, evolutionary philosopher, Daniel Dennett, who's not quite on board with the Sam Harris, everything is free will. As someone who studies psychology of decision making, my entire existence would seem irrelevant if there is no reason to study why we make decisions. So am I missing something in his argument?
Sam is making the case that we really are deluding ourselves into thinking we're making choices.
Right.
And I think it's tripped up with the idea of free will, like we're free of antecedent causes, including the things in our mind that are like ideas and values and so forth. So that's where I favor compatibilism. It builds that bridge between the physics that we know of deterministic things, but also the emergent property of this complex mental system, right? And whether you're making choices or someone else has got a gun to your head. And that's the real problem in our society, where we've got power over systems that are telling people to do things or else. Speaks to your COVID-19 stuff, right?
So I'm not very well versed in all the debates regarding free will, but maybe I'll draw an analogy. So destiny is not within the realm of science because it fails on the falsifiability principle, right? In other words, there is no experiment that I can design that would falsify the concept of destiny. Why? If I go outside of my house to find out if it's my destiny to be hit by a truck when I cross the street. If the truck hits me, that was my destiny. If the truck doesn't hit me, that was my destiny. So there is no state of the world where destiny is not manifested. Therefore, it's unfalsifiable. Therefore, it fails. Right? The free will argument, maybe I don't quite understand the nuances. It seems like that kind of gibberish. There is no way to navigate empirically through that thing. But when you're the Malibu meditator who can do, the waking app, then you can engage in the sophistry of this philosophizing. But I deal in the real world where I'm trying to get shit done, so I don't waste time on these kinds of things.
All right, let's thank Gad again, and let's go to dinner.